Into the DSA with a Program of Struggle by Proletariat. The revolutionary energies of the working class have been dispersed, atomized and isolated for the last half-century or more in America. No single group, movement or issue has been capable thus far of unifying the working class, such that the class becomes capable of constituting itself as a class fighting for its own power under its own banner. The DSA, with a national membership of 94,000 and many more hangers-on, is a far cry from a mass party when it exists in a nation of over 300 million people. But it dwarfs any other ostensibly leftist organization. More important than this is the apparent working class orientation that the DSA has, as well as its member-run structure. A recent development in the YDSA 2022 convention also saw the endorsement of Resolution 15, which calls for an independent working class socialist party. This is significant because up until this point the DSA has not considered itself to be a political party. What that makes it, exactly, is beyond me. This article is a call to arms for all revolutionaries in America to join the DSA and fight for it to become an independent working class party. This is not merely a formal question. To fight to transform the DSA into a working class party is fundamentally a programmatic battle that must be systemically waged from within the DSA. The following program is the only possible program for a working class party intent on fighting for power under its own banner in the current conditions. 1. Against all attacks on immigrant workers, for welcoming and organizing all workers. The First International notwithstanding, communists recognized the necessity of welcoming immigrant workers as reinforcements in the class struggle. Immigrant labor is labor which is actively seeking and struggling for better living conditions already. Organizing this labor into a party bent on creating a culture of workers' resistance to capitalism is a logical step to take. This looks like setting up hotlines to track and report the location of police checkpoints so that undocumented individuals do not get stopped. This looks like organizing to physically prevent the abduction of immigrant workers by ICE agents. This looks like tutoring the children of undocumented immigrants so they don't fall behind in school. This looks like organizing workplaces to fight against the adoption or the repeal of programs like E-Verify, which are designed to discriminate against undocumented labor. This looks like opposition to bills which will create closer linkages between ICE and local police departments. Ultimately, this looks like the struggle for automatic citizenship for all who live and work within the USA, while simultaneously using the resources of the USA to rebuild the basic social infrastructure of nations where immigrant workers are coming from. 2. Against all attacks on organized and organizing labor, for one big wage. It is no secret that organized labor has taken a beating since the 1970s, with unionization rates declining from 20% in 1983 to 10% in 2021. It is also no secret that recent years have seen an upsurge in union activity, from the successful unionization drives at Starbucks and Amazon, to large strikes such as the UAW strike against John Deere, to public approval for unions being at a relative high. What is less well known is the undermining of unions by the unions themselves. We cannot afford to repeat the mistakes made in the past. We must not, like the CIO during Operation Dixie, fight for unions which continue to enshrine wage differentials. We must recognize that the social needs of the working class are uniform and wages must also be uniform. This looks like fighting against multi-tiered wage systems. This looks like refusing to sacrifice a part of the class so that another part can advance its living conditions. This looks like fighting for the wages of the lowest paid members of the working class to be raised to the wages paid to the highest paid members of the working class, and fighting to raise those wages yet further. Ultimately, this means establishing an economic basis for unity within the working class, which enables the political unity of the working class such that the class may seize political power for itself and do away with the system of wage labor entirely. 3. Against all attempts at voter suppression, for the defense of black workers. Voter disenfranchisement has overwhelmingly been targeted at black workers through the use of voter ID laws and felon disenfranchisement laws coupled with felony drug charges. In 2010, 33% of male African Americans had received a felony charge. Not quite back to 3/5 of a person, but not very far off either. With felony charges being the means by which black workers become disenfranchised, the hyper-policing of black workers is the natural result, with the further result of the spree of murders by police inflicted upon primarily black workers. Further, even where black workers remain enfranchised, their attempts to organize and vote are literally raided and attacked by police on the way to the polls. Opposition to voter suppression and voter ID laws is toothless if it's not coupled with opposition to the institution that will suppress legal voters anyway. This looks like protests and demonstrations against police violence and voter ID laws. Ultimately, this looks like the complete disarmament of the police, the arrest of all individuals making up the police, the rehabilitation and reparation of all those currently incarcerated for non-violent crimes, and the formation of a workers' militia to suppress fascist violence. 4. Against all attacks on LGBTQIA+ peoples, for the free expression of gender identity and sexuality. The outrage surrounding trans girls competing in high school sports, the organized invasion of school board meetings by far-right elements to eliminate education surrounding LGBTQIA+ issues, the fretting over who uses which restrooms, the threats and acts of violence carried out against LGBTQIA+ peoples, and the denial of medical care to trans people all amount to a veritable training ground for future fascist foot soldiers. The defense of LGBTQIA+ peoples must be taken up explicitly with an eye to scattering and disorganizing the far-right forces that target them. This looks like organizing to speak out at school board meetings for a more thorough and inclusive curriculum. This looks like fighting against all attempts at discrimination, exclusion, and criminalization. This looks like joining pride parades with an eye to the defense of the participants. This looks like training LGBTQIA+ peoples in self-defense techniques. Ultimately, this looks like the best self-defense any of us can have, the complete mobilization of the working class fighting to meet human needs. 5. Against all attacks on women, for united working class. The overturn of Roe v. Wade, the threats and acts of violence carried out against reproductive healthcare providers, the restricted access to childcare, and the ever-present wage gap, which currently stands at 82 cents to the dollar, all amount to maintaining lower compensation for part of the labor force in an effort to maintain profit margins. The difficulties of childcare force many women out of work entirely and back into the domestic sphere. Where women are not forced out of the workplace, they're systemically paid at worse rates than men, and the lack of access to childcare and control over reproductive health care puts them at a permanent bargaining disadvantage. The struggle for women's rights must be taken up with an eye to women's labor in the workplace. This looks like defending reproductive health care centers from attacks, both physical and financial. This looks like fighting for one big wage and refusing to exclude women from this wage. This looks like defending women from workplace harassments. Ultimately, this looks like guaranteed childcare facilities, free access to quality reproductive health care, and the economic equality between men and women. The 5 points of this program were not chosen arbitrarily, and they are not separate and distinct from one another. The attacks waged by capital upon labor in the past decade have primarily been targeted in a 5-pronged fashion: upon immigrant labor, upon organized labor, upon black voters, upon LGBTQIA peoples, and upon women. Much like any pronged implement, the 5 prongs of this assault are fundamentally linked together. Who can forget the Trump policy of separating immigrant children away from their mothers? A policy which specifically targets immigrant women arriving with their children. Who can forget the massive West Virginia teacher strike? A strike consisting primarily of women teachers. When the highest unionization rates are concentrated in education, training, and library occupations, which are female-dominated industries, any assault upon organized labor immediately becomes an assault upon women. In similar fashion, women vote at higher rates than men do. This is particularly clear in the case of black women, so the assaults against voters automatically turn into assaults upon women. The organic connection between the fronts in this historical moment of the class war necessitates that we link these struggles together in a singular struggle which builds a culture of generalized resistance to capital. If this program looks nothing like other political programs you may have seen before, that is because this program is a communist program. It is not, like the tepid and toothless Erfurt program, of days better left in the waste bin of history, a program of political demands to be placed at the feet of the bourgeoisie. It is a program of struggle, which declares to the world that we will force our own solutions onto the world rather than making demands of the world. It is not a program which glosses over the differences that various segments of the working class experience in the forms of oppression capitalism applies to them. It is a program that recognizes the necessity of defending the most vulnerable sections of the working class, not merely because it is the moral thing to do, but because capital sharpens and prepares its weapons of general repression on the most marginal members of the working class first. It is a program that recognizes that by defending the most vulnerable sections of the working class becomes better prepared to liberate the entire working class with the power gained in the defense of its most vulnerable sections. It is not a program which purports to eventually achieve general human emancipation, because it is a program which recognizes that the conditions for general human emancipation currently do not exist. It is a program that recognizes itself as necessary but insufficient for creating those conditions for general human emancipation. In short, it is a program that has transformed communism from a nice idea into a material necessity. Struggling for this program within the DSA will require the DSA to take itself seriously as a political party bent on acquiring and wielding political power to implement its own program. It will mean the end of endorsing candidates, political or union, that are not answerable to the DSA. It will require all candidates endorsed by the DSA to sign an undated letter of resignation to be published upon the candidate's betrayal of any part of the working class. It will require all endorsed candidates to surrender any salary from an elected position above the average salary of the workers that they represent to the DSA. In short, it will require the DSA to radically transform itself into something different. The DSA may prove incapable of fulfilling this role, but it is the only place we can start fighting for this program at present. If this program is not adopted, then it will be turned against us in the most important global struggle that presently exists, the war raging in Ukraine. The question at this very moment is world war or world revolution. The bourgeoisie will have their own version of this program in their effort to push world war. As the war engine revs up, citizenship for undocumented immigrants will be promised in return for military service. Childcare and decent wages will be offered to women working in war industries. Inclusivity and acceptance will be promoted by the military to encourage further enlistment from Black and LGBTQIA+ peoples. Inflation will level wages down to a near universal, miserable minimum. If we do not adopt the above outlined program, the bourgeoisie will weaponize it against us, and they will turn half the world into an abattoir. It is here that an explicit criticism of the DSA's statement on Russia's invasion of Ukraine is demanded. We must be adamantly opposed to capitalist diplomacy, which only serves to divvy up the blood of the working class between competing capitalists. Unlike the DSA-IC, we hold that the only solution to the conflict is through war, the class war of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. Struggling for a diplomatic solution to the problem is no different than trying to prevent capitalism from going into economic crisis. Capitalist war is simply the opposite side of the coin of capitalist peace. It is not a question of which state of affairs is more favorable to the working class. The fact is that capitalist peace merely paves the way towards capitalist war, no less than the highs in the capitalist cycle paved the way towards the inevitable depression. The solution is ever to struggle against capitalism in whatever phase it exists, without deluding ourselves that one phase or another is more propitious for that struggle.